Hi, this is Mike Ferguson.
And I'm Mike Morford, and we're the host of the true crime podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered a variety of cases, both solved and unsolved, from missing persons to mysterious murders.
Some of the cases we cover are well-known and historic ones that you may be aware of, while other ones may be intriguing ones from small towns that you've never heard of. A lot of the cases we explore are currently breaking in the news.
We have about 400 episodes for you to binge on right now, including full seasons on the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy.
You can find Criminology on every major podcast platform, and new episodes drop every Saturday night. Subscribe today so you don't miss an episode.
You're listening to Below the Surface, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Campus Killings, and Killer Communications. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
A missing person, a strange death, a vanished vehicle, a series of unanswerable questions. In so many true crime mysteries, the answers remain elusive. But in many instances, the clues lead right to the water's edge, and sometimes the truth lies below the surface. Welcome back to Below the Surface. I'm your host, Olivia, and today I'll be unpacking the tragic case of Knoll, Missouri's bank president, Dan Short. In October of 1989, he was found floating in Grand Lake near Grove, Oklahoma, 5 days after his bank was robbed and he'd gone missing. The investigation into how Dan ended up in the lake revealed not one, but two deadly perpetrators. Let's dive in. On the morning of October 6, 1989, the small town of Knoll, Missouri had yet to know that something awful had happened the night before. The quiet little community of around 1,000 people who prided itself on its low crime rate was turned upside down when the bank secretary showed up at 8 a.m. to unlock the doors and begin her day. Much to her shock, the doors weren't locked, and when she went inside, she saw that the bank vault was wide open and tons of money was missing. She immediately called police, and since the bank was a federally owned agency, the FBI took over the case immediately. Upon initial investigation, police found that the lone security camera had been shot out and several .45 caliber shell casings were found on the floor. The vault was missing around $70,000, and it was mostly in coins, and a hidden compartment containing over $100,000 in large bills was left intact. It was a strange robbery, especially since the building's alarms hadn't been tripped and the vault's security locks had not been tampered with. This meant whoever had opened the vault had the codes and knew how to disarm the alarms. And there were only 4 people on the bank staff who knew this, 3 of which showed up to the bank that morning and were questioned by police. The only one who didn't show up was the bank's president, Dan Short. 51-year-old Dan Short had been State Bank's president for 8 years, and he was incredibly well-liked around the small town of Knoll. He knew everyone, and they all knew him. He was a devoted father to his 2 children, and though he was going through a divorce at the time of the robbery, everyone described him as a kind and a thoughtful man. But the fact that he wasn't answering the phone made law enforcement suspicious. Had he robbed his own bank? According to the bank's vice president, Dan often worked late and would put the alarm system on standby so that he could come back to work after the rest of the staff had gone home. It wasn't out of the ordinary, but it did mean that Dan had specifically not set any alarms on the night of the robbery. Investigators needed to speak to Dan, but when they went to his house on the Missouri border, which was around a 30-minute ride from the bank, he wasn't home and his truck was gone. They returned to Knoll, growing suspicious of whether or not Dan was involved in the robbery of his very own bank. But only a few hours later, a resident brought investigators a tip. The owner of Sibley Manufacturing, just outside the Knoll border, told police he'd found an abandoned truck behind his factory. The registration came back to the bank president, and police found dozens of coin rolls scattered all over the truck bed. Fingerprints were taken from the truck, but they all came back to Dan. At this juncture, the evidence seemed to point to Dan as the perpetrator of the robbery, So the FBI put a stop on his credit card and had all local airports and car rental agencies on alert, just in case he was trying to flee the area. They also secured a search warrant for his house, but aside from an overturned trash can and Dan's glasses left on the bedside table, there was nothing to confirm whether he'd fled or if he'd met with some kind of foul play. A neighbour told police she'd seen headlights entering his property around 2 a.m. the night of the robbery, and they were gone around 15 minutes later. When agents asked if Dan would have left his glasses before leaving the house, all of the neighbours agreed he never went anywhere without them because he had very poor eyesight. With all of this information, investigators began to fear that Dan was not the perpetrator and that he had been abducted by the actual bank robbers. There was a high possibility his life was either in danger or that he was already deceased. More FBI agents were brought in from the Kansas City office and a task force was set up in Knoll to handle the amount of leads that residents were feeding to local law enforcement about where Dan could be. While the FBI worked out of Knoll's armory to comb through the potential tips, local police fanned out across the town, starting with Dan's abandoned truck to see if they could find him. But 5 days later, there were no traces of Dan, and none of the tips had led investigators to find anything at all that was useful. That was until October 11th, which was the 5th day of the search. A couple called in that they'd been fishing on Grand Lake near the Missouri-Oklahoma border and that they'd found a submerged body. They said they could see a head and arms just below the surface. The FBI rushed to the scene and they found the body of a deceased male bound to an old wooden chair with duct tape. The chair had been weighed down with a concrete block and a heavy chain hoist. As investigators searched the body, they found a wallet in the deceased man's back pocket. Inside was Dan Short's driver's license. Though badly decomposed due to time and submersion in the water, the coroner was able to determine that the man had been dead for around 5 days, which fit the timeline of the robbery and the disappearance. He'd also been alive when he entered the water. Dan Short had met a brutal end at the hands of whoever had abducted him, but investigators had no leads. As they dug into tips and assessed evidence from the robbery scene, the FBI forensics team began testing everything that was recovered from the lake. The chair and the chain hoist were photographed and the images were distributed to Knoll and surrounding towns to see if anyone knew where they had come from. The duct tape that had bound Dan to the chair was carefully removed and specialists spent weeks dusting it for prints and piecing it back together to decipher if it had come from one singular roll or from multiple rolls. In the end, there were unfortunately no fingerprints, but forensic specialists were able to determine that all the pieces had been from one continuous roll of tape. However, one piece was missing. The chair had snapped on impact when Dan hit the water, and the duct tape that had bound his right ankle to the chair was missing. It was the only piece that was unaccounted for, and it was thought to be likely unretrievable. So authorities were shocked when they got a call from Oklahoma resident named Rowdy Foreman. He'd been fishing on the shores of Grand Lake and had noticed a random piece of duct tape not far from a washed-up wooden dowel that looked like a lower chair brace. He'd watched the news and had heard about Dan Short's murder, so he'd carefully bagged the items without touching them. Agents retrieved the evidence, and even before sending it to the forensics lab, they could see a clear fingerprint on the edge of the tape. Later tests revealed the print was made from engine grease, which was why it held up to the water and why it had survived after being submerged in the lake for so long. The duct tape piece was also determined to be a match to the rest of the roll that had been used to bind Dan Short to the chair. The only unfortunate news for investigators was that the print did not come back to anyone in the national database after searching for a hit. But not all hope was lost, because a tip came in from an anonymous Knoll citizen that the FBI should question 2 brothers named Joe and Shannon Ogofsky, who had been using large quantities of coins to buy things around the town. Since the rolls of coins had been predominantly what was stolen from the bank, this seemed like an excellent tip to follow. Agents found the older Ogofsky brother Joe at a junkyard where he was working on his car. He readily cooperated, stating that he'd been with his girlfriend who lived around 40 miles north of Knoll the whole week, and he hadn't even heard about the robbery until he'd returned. When he was asked if he owned any .45 caliber handguns, he said he did, and he told police that they could find him at his home, where his brother Shannon would be happy to hand them over for testing against the casings found at the bank. Shannon was also agreeable when police arrived, readily handing over the weapons and telling police he'd been at home with his mother all night on the evening of the robbery. The guns were tested and were not a match for the casings that were found at the scene, so the FBI ruled the brothers out. After all, it wasn't against the law to pay for some things with coins. However, only a few days later, the FBI received a tip from another Knoll native, Wayne Butane, who claimed that he recognised the chain hoist from the photographs that the FBI had shared with the public. The hook found at the crime scene had the same damage as the one Wayne owned while he'd been living in a rental property owned by the Agofsky brothers. Wayne had temporarily left the hoist there while in the process of moving out, but when he went to get it, it was gone. He reported that the hoist was stolen, but the Agofsky brothers had denied taking it, and police were unable to recover it. Another tip came in from an overnight truck driver who said that around 3 a.m. on the night of the robbery, he'd been driving over the Cowskin Bridge and he had seen a two-tone van and a red truck that resembled Dan Short's and a third unknown sedan pulled over at the middle of the bridge. Coincidentally, when investigators paid a second visit to the Agofsky residence, they saw a two-tone van and a brown van parked beside the house that closely matched the description given by the eyewitnesses. It belonged to the brothers' mother, Sheila, and she denied knowing anything about her van being seen on the bridge in the middle of the night. She also denied knowing anything about Wayne Butane's chain hoist and corroborated Shannon's story that he had been home with her all night on the night of the robbery. However, Joe told investigators he did remember seeing the hoist on their property, but he had no idea what had become of it. He figured Wayne had picked it up when he wasn't home. Shannon's story was different. He claimed he'd never even heard of the chain hoist. But by this point in the investigation, the fingerprint found on the missing duct tape had been brought to the FBI's attention, and evidence was starting to point to the Agofsky family as persons of interest. Agents requested fingerprints from the two brothers. Joe readily agreed, but his fingerprints were not a match, though they were said to be incredibly close. So close that forensic analysts asked investigators if Joe happened to have a sibling. So while everyone's prints are unique, siblings' fingerprints are often incredibly close to each other. Investigators, of course, already knew about Shannon, and this information raised their suspicions about him even more. Though he promised to come to the police station on multiple occasions, he never showed up for his fingerprint appointments. So agents followed the brothers around town to gather enough evidence around Shannon to obtain a warrant for his prints. In a short span, Shannon and Joe were both seen buying large quantities of expensive items like speakers, TVs, and other electronics, and they both bought cars in cash, though neither of them was employed. But this wasn't enough evidence to obtain a warrant. Investigators noticed that the brothers frequently hung out with a young man named Grant Sanders. He was Shannon's roommate, and the three of them spent a lot of time at the junkyard working on their cars. Investigators hoped that they could pressure Grant into giving up any incriminating information that would lead to a warrant for Shannon. But Grant proved to be a hard nut to crack, so the FBI went for a different tactic. They asked Shannon if he would submit to a polygraph about his whereabouts on the night of the robbery. He readily agreed, and though the examiner found him to be deceptive about his knowledge of the robbery and Dan Short's disappearance, it still wasn't enough to get a warrant for his prints. Investigators had one last Hail Mary, so they had the Agofsky family sit before a grand jury in December of 1989. Both of the brothers and their mother Sheila testified that they had no knowledge of the bank robbery or of Dan Short's murder. However, the grand jury told Shannon to submit his fingerprints. He agreed, but once again, he never showed up for his appointment. But this time, the grand jury's request meant that the FBI could subpoena Shannon for his prints. 5 months after Dan's murder, Shannon's fingerprints were finally sent to the lab for comparison against the duct tape. However, it would take several months for this comparison to be conducted, so Shannon could not be held on any charges. But this didn't mean that investigators weren't still building a case against him. They went back to talk to Grant Saunders. One of the tips investigators had received was that a third vehicle had been seen leaving Dan's property on the night of the robbery, and that same vehicle had been spotted leaving Knoll behind the two-tone van and heading towards the Cowskin Bridge. Investigators believe Grant may have been involved as a getaway driver, but though they pressured him on several occasions to turn on his friends, it took 6 months before Grant called police in June of 1990, saying that he was ready to talk to them. While Grant claimed that he had nothing to do with the bank robbery or Dan Short's murder, he and the brothers had been involved in illegal activities. In December of 1989, the brothers had broken into a Knoll home and stolen several rifles. The following day, Grant and Shannon drove across state lines and sold the guns in Arkansas. The brothers had also asked Grant to be involved in a much more violent gun run only a short time before the bank robbery, but Grant refused when they told him he may have to kill someone. While Grant passed a polygraph test 3 times in relation to his involvement in Dan's murder and the bank robbery, his claims about the illegal gun sales over state lines was enough evidence for the FBI to put out an arrest warrant for Shannon. However, after the subpoena for his prints, Shannon fled Knoll, and it was several months before police tracked him to a house in Arkansas and arrested him. Shannon was booked into the Springfield Federal Courthouse, and not long after he was caught, the FBI got word from the forensic labs that his prints were a direct match to the print found on the duct tape. But they still needed to know if Joe Agofsky had been part of the robbery and Dan's murder. Aside from Grant's testimony that Joe had accompanied Shannon on the break-in to steal the rifles and had been part of a more violent plot for a second gun run, law enforcement had no clear evidence tying Joe to anything. Investigators subpoenaed Joe's phone records from the night of the robbery, and they found that he'd made several long-distance phone calls to his girlfriend right before the time of the robbery, meaning that he had not been with her as he had claimed. They also got his bank records and found that in the 16 months following the robbery, Joe had spent over $19,000 in cash despite being unemployed and having no income. For reference, this would be the equivalent of spending around $50,000 in today's money. But the last piece of evidence was the most integral. Investigators went back to Grant Saunders and asked him if Joe specifically had had anything to do with Dan Short's murder. Grant replied that actually yes, Joe was the whole reason for abducting Dan for the bank robbery. Grant explained that a few weeks before the robbery, the 3 of them had been hanging out at the junkyard when a wealthy banker from a nearby town came to pick up his car from the yard's repair shop. As he walked by, Joe made a passing comment that what they should do was follow the banker home, kidnap him, and force him to open the bank vault so they could easily steal all the money. Grant had responded that the idea sounded like a really easy way to get rich, but then he'd gone home and said he hadn't thought anything else about it. That was until bank president Dan Short ended up drowned in Grand Lake. Joe and Shannon had clearly decided to go ahead with Joe's idea. Following this, investigators dug deeper into Joe's history and found that about a week before the robbery, he'd opened up a safety deposit box at the state bank. He'd also asked very specific questions about Dan Short while he was there. The questions included where he lived, when he usually came to work at the bank, and how often he was in. It was enough to arrest Joe Agofsky. Both brothers were indicted on 3 federal counts for bank robbery and 1 count for murder. From what we could find, there were no pleas on the table for the brothers, and the trial for the bank robbery began in September of 1992. The circumstantial evidence and testimony from Grant Saunders convinced a jury to find both brothers guilty of the bank robbery and the illegal firearms sales across state lines. Both men received life sentences plus 5 years for the crimes. However, the trial for Dan Short's murder wouldn't happen until 1997 due to several court appeals and other delays. In the second trial, due to the forensic evidence of the fingerprints, the jury only found Shannon guilty. They could not reach a verdict on Joe, but since both men were serving life sentences for the robbery, the prosecution did not retry Joe for the murder charges. Joe spent his incarceration at a federal prison in North Carolina, where he died from unknown causes in 2013. Shannon was sent to Beaumont Correctional Facility in Texas from 1992 until 2001, where he murdered a fellow inmate. He was convicted of this murder in 2004 and he was sentenced to death. He was moved to the U.S. Penitentiary Death Row in Indiana. But in late 2024, Shannon's death sentence, along with 37 other federal death row inmates, was commuted to life without parole by then-President Biden. In an official statement, President Biden explained, "Make no mistake, I condemn these murderers, I grieve for the victims of their despicable acts and ache for all of the families who have suffered unimaginable and irreparable loss. But guided by my conscience and my experience as a public defender, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Vice President and now President, I am more convinced than ever we must stop the use of the death penalty at the federal level." On December 30th, 2024, Shannon chose to file a motion blocking the commutation as he believes the life sentence will put him at a legal disadvantage in his plans to seek appeals based on the claims of his innocence. While Shannon continues to appeal, the Short family has endured 3 decades without Dan. He was buried in the Southwest City Cemetery in McDonald County, Missouri at only 51 years old. He has missed his children's graduations, their weddings, and meeting his own grandchildren because he was violently strapped to a weighted chair and thrown 30 feet over the side of the bridge by kidnappers who'd forced him to rob his own bank. Sources for this episode include FBI Files, Forensic Files, Oxygen, Unsolved Mysteries, Find a Grave, KOAM News, The Oklahomian, and News on 6. We'd love for you to follow us on social media. We're on every major platform, so search for us on your favourites, and we'll be sure to include links in the show notes. You can also find us on our website, belowthesurfacepodcast.net. If you'd like to show your support for this show and get your episodes early and ad-free, consider an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, not only will you get early and ad-free access to this show, but to every show on the AbJack network of shows. To get started, just head over to Apple Podcasts and search for the AbJack Entertainment channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Finally, we'd very much appreciate you leaving a rating or review on the platform you're listening to us now on. This will really help us grow and it helps new listeners to find the show. And please tell your friends about Below the Surface. Nothing beats word of mouth. We will see you back in 2 weeks with an all-new episode. Thank you all so much.
Below the Surface is hosted and narrated by Olivia McKenzie, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro, and it's produced by Mike Morford for AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to join us for the next episode of Below the Surface.